During the last month, I dedicated myself to reading dozens of Clayface comics from various eras of Batman just to be able to understand what the true essence of the character is. And let me tell you, whatever you think you know about the character, you probably don't know the whole story. And the thing is, when we mention Clayface, we all imagine this shape-shifting character made of clay, whose main trait is his ability to imitate the people around him. But this is a much more modern version of the character, one that actually combines elements from several other Clayfaces that existed before. And over the years, Clayface has been just a simple killer without powers. A thief with impressive skills, a scientist with a huge need for affection, a woman with the desire to change, willing to do anything, and even a Clayface who was the child of two of these. The point is that what we usually think of as Clayface is actually a modern construct that takes elements from several past versions of the character. All versions share a dark story about identity, tragedy, and acceptance. How did the character evolve? How did he transform from a powerless killer to a cultural icon getting his own movie? In this video, we'll analyze the best Clayface stories ever published, to fully understand his evolution and see what might be in store for us in his upcoming movie. My name is Go the Geek Monitor, and today we're going to take Clayface very seriously. Even though Clayface may not be as culturally significant as villains like Riddler or Two-Face, he is actually one of Batman's oldest foes. His first appearance was in June 1940, only 2 months after Joker was first published. And for that reason, the first version of Clayface shares several characteristics with him. In the early 40s, Batman comics, even though they were aimed at children, had a pretty dark tone. This came from the crime and mystery stories of the pulp magazines of those years, violent comics aimed at adults where killers were the main antagonists. That's why when we first saw Joker, we saw him as a macabre serial killer, and the same thing happens with Clayface. In his debut, Basil Karloff was a famous horror actor, much like Boris Karloff in real life. In fact, his name comes from there, and he starts killing the actors involved in the production of the remake of a movie called The Castle of Terror. Why does he start doing this? Because he was the star of the original movie and felt offended that someone else was replacing him in the remake. Using his acting skills, he disguises himself as Clayface, a character he once played, and commits crimes until Batman and Robin stop him. It's a simple story, but at the end, Batman says something about Clayface that sets up the character's future development. In his words, Basil Karloff had played so many roles in horror movies that they ended up possessing his mystery. That's true, since a few issues later he escapes the police. First, he puts on makeup to become Clayface and tries to burn down the studio that made the Castle of Terror. Notice how these early stories show us a Clayface whose main motivation isn't ambition, but ego. That's why his first crimes begin when he feels left out. Another interesting thing is we see the character's obsession with inhabiting a body that's not his own. This shows the character discusses identity from the start. Basil Karloff lacks powers, but he can become someone else using his acting skills. The character didn't meet expectations and was forgotten for years. Until the comic book industry changed in the mid-50s, comic book censorship laws had intensified due to some controversies. So the industry had to move away from these dark stories and focus on fun themes that had more to do with science fiction. This was when the writer Bill Finger came up with the idea of bringing Clayface back, but with a different concept. This was a common practice in those years where Detective Comics would bring back old characters but with completely different stories. This is the story of Clayface 2 from 1961. Matt Hagen always looked for shortcuts in life. One day, instead of working, he searches for treasure from a sunken ship, because who hasn't done that? Matt can't find a ship but discovers an underground cavern with a mysterious protoplasm spring, which turns Matt into a clay-like creature with the ability to change shape at will. For the first time, Clayface has powers and quickly uses them to steal money from a charity. He defeats Batman and Robin because his powers make him a very dangerous enemy. In fact, they can't beat him in a fair fight. They realize Matt must recharge his powers every 48 hours and exploit this weakness to defeat him. Notice something curious in this comic's first appearance of Matt Hagen. He regularly takes the form of various real or fantastic animals, but we don't see him use his characteristic move, taking the form of another person. This changes in his second encounter, where we see the character for the first time tricking Batman and Robin by pretending to be someone else. These stories are simple and describe a less interesting Clayface origin with more typical motives like seeking money. The abilities of this second Clayface are those most often remembered when discussing the character, and he stayed an iconic Batman villain until Matt died in Crisis on Infinite Earths. These two Clayfaces are the most iconic, and their origins would eventually be reinterpreted and even mixed together. We'll cover that soon, but first let's quickly discuss other Clayfaces who also shaped the character's cultural image. Preston Payne the First is a scientist who grew up with hyperpituitarism, a condition causing excess hormone secretion from the pituitary gland. In his case, this meant tumors grew all over his body, leading to discrimination due to his appearance. As he grew up, he worked at Star Labs and became obsessed with Matt Hagen, believing Clayface's abilities were key to changing his appearance. He started experimenting with his blood and later injected it into himself, but like any villain's origin, things didn't go as planned. Initially, Preston believed everything was a success and even went on a date, but soon realized the reaction was unstable and his body became deformed. But the effects were even worse. The experiment not only altered him physically, but his mind, which used to be his only refuge, also began to deteriorate. Not only that, but he realized that his body had developed an even more disturbing ability, the power to dissolve anyone he touches. This is when the character truly starts to become tragic, much more so than any other Clayface to date. Because Preston began to suffer from intense and painful fevers which could only be relieved by touching other people, even though this meant killing them. Interestingly, this character was created from a need for affection and contact. Life, once limited for him by his appearance, now seemed to have fully denied him. At first, we might think Preston is a very different Clayface from the others since he looks so different. Because of the technological armor he wears, which keeps him stable and gives him super strength, and the fact that his powers don't seem to be linked to what we usually think of as Clayface. If you think about it, there's also a theme of transformation and identity, since Preston always wanted to be different from who he was. And he develops an obsession with not accepting himself, just like what happened to Basil Karlo. Something similar happens with Sondra Fuller Clayface 4, who hated her own face. That's why she let the criminal Cobra alter her body for those abilities. These abilities were much like Matt Hagen's, except in Sondra's stories. She focused more on copying not only people, but also the abilities of superheroes. Plus, her power wasn't limited to just 48 hours, like in Matt Hagen's case. Again, we see a narrative of someone wanting to become more than they are, seeking a new identity. This is when Basil Karlo, the original Clayface, returns. After leaving prison, he decides to gather all the Clayfaces to create a criminal group known as No. I mean, it's not a joke really. They called themselves the Moth Pack, but even though the name sounds kind of absurd, this story had major implications for the character of Clayface. In this story arc, Basil Karlo is introduced for the first time as a criminal genius with great ambitions. He tricks Preston and Sondra, steals their abilities, and becomes the so-called Supreme Clayface. Much closer to what we mean when we mention Clayface. Since he has Basil's acting skills, Matt and Sondra's powers, and even Preston's death touch, although he is able to control it. This story was published in 1989. And from there we saw other less relevant Clayfaces in the comics, such as Cassius Payne, who is the son of Preston and Sondra, or Peter Maley, who was a scientist infected by Cassius. But, in my opinion, the Clayface we all know and who will even be adapted in next year's movie. In Batman, the animated series, Clayface is more significant than you might realize. Since it doesn't adapt a single comic character but instead combines several, it completely redefines Clayface. In the episode Feet of Clay, we're introduced to Matt Hagen, an actor who falls from grace after a car accident leaves his face permanently scarred. However, an experimental cream lets him reshape his face and keep acting, but Matt doesn't realize it slowly becomes addictive. To earn more, Matt has to take illegal jobs from the owner of the cream company, until he is exposed to massive amounts of the product, which end up turning him into a clay creature capable of changing shape at will. But this is something we hadn't actually seen in the comics until this date. This Clayface combines traits from the first comic Clayface, Basil Karlo, the powers and name of the second, Matt Hagen, and the dependency causing physical suffering seen in the third, Preston Payne. It also introduces new elements, as this was his first time given this origin. A famous actor turns to an experimental chemical to avoid ending his career. By combining these elements, the cartoon redefined the character, making him more powerful by using the most interesting aspects of each Clayface. This episode shows it all, ending with Batman seemingly defeating him by confusing him with his own images on a screen along with Clayface, deceiving the world's greatest detective by faking his own death just to have another chance to live beyond the mistakes he had made. It's an episode that, like many others in Batman the Animated Series, shows us that so-called monsters aren't born out of nowhere, and above all, it makes us feel empathy for Clayface's tragedy. The man who thought he had lost everything in an accident, only to later discover that he still had much more to lose. From here, this became our cultural vision of the character. Even in the comics, a unified vision of Clayface appeared by altering and expanding his origin, such as in the New 52 continuity. Basil Karlo is a young man craving affection and attention who suffers from never standing out, which ultimately impacts his acting career. He asks the Penguin for help, who provides a special underworld substance that lets him finally stand out and excel in his desired roles. Basil is later blackmailed by the Penguin into helping with crimes. This new origin borrows many elements from Batman, the Animated Series, like the fact that Clayface is an actor who gains powers after using a strange substance and is later blackmailed into starting a life of crime. But at the same time, it replaces the accident that leaves him disfigured with a sense of existential emptiness. Basil is only able to fill this void with attention and external validation. In this comic, Basil kidnaps people, injects them with Joker toxin, and makes them his audience until Batman intervenes. Other stories where we see Basil's excessive ego as an actor at play include this one we saw in Joker's Asylum, where Basil goes so far as to destroy a movie theater. He feels insulted that his classic horror films are shown at a low-class festival. In one bad day, he auditions for a movie but ends up killing the whole production cast, because he has an acting vision for this film that the rest of the creative team simply doesn't share. We've also seen these elements in the animated comedy series Harley Quinn, which features one of my favorite versions of Basil Karlo. Some writers can't distinguish between Basil Karlo and Matt Hagen. Basil is interesting for his motivations, personality, and movie actor origins, while Matt is mainly interesting for his powers. But then there are stories like this from the New 52 era, where Basil Karlo is shown as a foolish criminal just seeking money. Characteristics are now more associated with Matt Hagen. The character was also given a redemption arc as the Rebirth universe reveals about Basil Karlo. Little by little, he started losing his sanity after he began using a chemical product he needed, after a car accident that would have ended his career. This closely resembles Batman, the animated series, but features Basil instead of Matt. This time, Batman decides Basil needs therapy and rehabilitation instead of punishment. He gives him a bracelet to control the chemical-induced delusions and brings him into a vigilante group. He forms a friendship with Tim Drake, Spoiler, Batwoman, and Orphan. The Clayfaces share more similarities than you'd expect. Each has a unique origin, abilities, personality, and appearance, yet if you look closely, they all share the same tragedy. That of being someone who wants to be more than what they are. Sometimes they do it to receive applause and admiration from the public after a job well done. Sometimes it's because they're not satisfied with their life, and there are versions that want to be something more because they suffer being who they are. The tragedy is that once they change, they can't return to who they were. And that's why when they announced that we would probably see the character in the sequel to the Batman, I got really excited because I feel like there could be a great story there. Since Batman is also a character who distances himself from his own identity, that of Bruce Wayne, and eventually ends up becoming something else out of necessity, Batman. But what are the dangers of abandoning your own identity and adopting another? That would be a question that Clayface could answer perfectly in a movie as the antagonist. They chose a different approach, like the Joker movie, an origin story separate from Batman, focusing on the tragedy of actor Matt Hagen. Like in that Batman the Animated Series episode, which I think could inspire a great story. We may get a body horror film like The Substance, about an actor seeking love, attention, and applause, who eventually turns into a monster. It's not the accident he suffers, but his actions afterward. If that's the case, the film could take elements from classic movies like Frankenstein and give us a message about humans, monsters, and the distinction between the two, which I also really like. And this makes me think that after reading dozens of Clayface comics, I think that in the end, what surprises me most about him is that, just like in the comics, the way we see Clayface, it's not just one, but rather a fusion of several faces, names, and above all, tragedies. If you enjoyed this in-depth look at Clayface, check out this playlist for more videos. I read many comics to learn about characters like Joker, Superman, Captain America, and Penguin. If you enjoyed this video, check out this playlist. That's it for today. I'm Go the Geek Monitor. Keep looking beyond the obvious.